Trade networks at exchange in Seram. Another outcome of my doctoral work and emerging thinking on human cultural populations in wider ecological systems arose from the inadequacy, as I saw it, of the classic village study and the difficulty of defining boundaries around any local system to be analysed. This is a problem that I had faced in my attempts to grapple with Rappaport's study of ritual adaptation in the Bismarck Mountains. After all, he had fairly convincingly showed how these processes might work for a single subclan, the Sembaga, but it was much more difficult to see how it all worked out at a wider scale, at a higher scale, for the Maring people in general. Similarly, Nuolu villages, after all, had always been connected through the flow of materials and social exchange with many other populations over the hundreds of years. Their predecessors had been moving through the landscape of Seram. But there was also another more specific reason why I was problematizing these issues, namely a growing interest in how local Moluccan populations articulated with the ancient trade in spices going back centuries before the arrival of the first Europeans, and how the intensification of spice production brought about by the arrival of the Dutch impacted on ecology and social economy. It thus raised issues about nested systems and about how local systems articulated with regional and ultimately global transactions. The first statement of this problem came in 1978 in the form of a paper that I presented at the Cambridge Conference on Social and Ecological Systems that I mentioned in the previous talk. And this paper was called Sago Subsistence and the Trade in Spices. My argument was this: early Moluccan populations living on small islands were drawn into the spice trade, growing clove in the north and the central Moluccas, and nutmeg in the Banda Archipelago and in Seram. However, being long dependent on the sago palm for basic starch in their diet, as spice production expanded, so they increasingly relied on the import of sago from adjacent larger islands, from Halmahera, Seram, and from New Guinea, as local sago palms became scarce. This scarcity was driven by the increased planting under sort of plantation conditions of both nutmeg and clove. The cycle of positive feedback was the engine, therefore, driving socio-economic change for many centuries, latterly in the context of the economy of the Dutch East India Company, and thereafter that of the Netherlands Indies. The field research which followed and which underpinned this growing interest in inter-island trade was undertaken in 1981 and 1986. In 1981, with my wife, Nicola Goward, and in 1986, by myself. In 1981, we visited a wide arc of locations in the Central Moluccas and had different kinds, and these places had different kinds and degrees of integration through historical trade relationships within the context of different systemic levels and in relation to the hubs and central places in those systems. In 1986, I focused specifically on the Geisser and Gorom archipelagos of East Seram. The results were published in a series of papers and culminating in 2003 in a book on the edge of the Banda Zone, past and present in the social organization of a Moluccan trading network. This book sought to focus an anthropological lens on the dynamics of trade in a specific area in East Seram, particularly in the Geisser and Gorom archipelagos. The point of departure was a description of trade relations in this zone between 1970 and 1990, but with much minor implications. For 500 years, and probably much longer, the zone served as a corridor between Eurasia and the Southwest Pacific, and played a vital role in the distribution of nutmeg and other high-valued commodities that had for centuries high impacts on the global economy. The islands themselves were minute and fragile ecosystems, ultimately dependent on the local networks of which they are part, and on the long-distance trade that has bound them to mainland Asia and beyond. The research involved not only fieldwork, but also extensive archival and secondary sources, something which was made possible through a period spent in the Netherlands Institute for Advanced Studies, NIAS, then at Wassenaar. This was in 1984. The book tried to demonstrate the enduring continuities in a local system as it came into contact with the outside world, illuminating how barter, ecological and ethnic divisions of labor, exchange patterns, and the organization of trade between Seram and New Guinea coast helped to make sense of long-term cycles and trends. This was very different than my work amongst the Noolu, drawing me into literature on central place theory, multi-sited ethnography, historical anthropology, and world systems theory. Conversations with historians and historical geographers, as well as experts on boat building and navigation. There were spin-offs in terms of insights into the historical relationship between the Dutch and local political domains, and during the late colonial period, and much more recently about the impacts on the ecological resilience and biodiversity conservation of these reef and mangrove systems, long exposed to global contact. And if anybody is interested in looking at my work on the impact of local networks on subsistence resilience and biodiversity in this area, there is a recent paper published in Ambio in 2019.